Okay, so a little bit of an unusual one for me, this, because it's not very often that I talk in my videos about subjects of race and racism, but that's what I want to do today. There's probably two reasons that I don't talk about it very often, even though there are obviously tangible issues within our society that pertain to these things. But I think there are two things. One is that I think that society ends up, making more of race than it needs to, and it almost becomes a situation where it is a permanent open wound that on pain of death we will not allow to heal, right? That wound will remain open by hook or by crook, and whatever happens, we will find something else to talk about to keep that wound fresh, to stop it dying down. If the issues that we have seal up, well, we'll open it up in some other way. We'll find some kind of microaggression situation, something that then becomes the key issue as to why everything is absolutely terrible within our society with regard to issues of race and racism. That's the first thing. The second thing is that when I look behind the subject of race and racism, although they're real subjects, I don't find very much substantial behind them. I mean, okay, there are obviously some differences between people of different ethnic origins when taken on a statistical level. If there weren't, we wouldn't be able to identify them. So that's true, even if it's just trivially true in that sense. But I don't see the same kind of tangible and intractable differences which you would see in a subject such as biological sex and gender, for example, whereby I look at the issues that we have with claims of sexism in society as utterly intractable in a way that I think issues of race are not. Because while ever we have the asymmetries which are bound to exist, for example, to give you a single example of that, although there are several I could give, the simple fact that most people are heterosexual means that inevitably men view women in a different light to how they view other men, and women view men in a different light to how they view other women, and that creates an asymmetry in and of itself. And while ever that asymmetry exists, there will be people who pick up on the conclusions of that asymmetry and insist that what they're seeing there is sexism, even when it quite clearly to the rest of us isn't. And I don't think we can ever hope actually to move beyond that. But I think that race is a different thing. But there is one subject that I talked about before, and I've got to talk about again because to me it's an exception. And this is this business, this bollocks of cultural appropriation. And why I want to talk about cultural appropriation, why I think that's an issue that's worth me discussing, is not because it's such a huge issue in itself, right? It's not because the allegations of cultural appropriation exist in and of themselves, because racists exist and racists are going to say racist things. It's because I am continually astonished that the mainstream media takes these things seriously and adopts an approach to these things which they would not in a million years adopt that approach if it took any other form of what is overt, unblinking racism. So what's triggered this off today? Well, it was linked from an article that I was looking at on the BBC to another article on the BBC. The first article I was looking on the BBC is not the one I want to talk about, but it was about something called blackfishing. And the article was entitled "Blackfishing, the Women Accused of Pretending to be Black." Now, I don't particularly want to talk about that, but it was slightly ironic in that what the article was talking about was white women, or at least women that don't class as black, trying to pass as black in some way, trying to take on the trappings of blackness, whatever that could be, dressing in a certain way, acting in a certain way, trying to make their skin darker. And what I found really interesting is this seemed to be kind of a mirror of something that I'd read about numerous times in the past, which is black women trying to take on the trappings and the culture and the look of being white, or at least not black. And what's interesting, the one thing comment I will make with regard to that is this is a perfect example of sort of heads I win, tails you lose, is that that was portrayed as typifying white privilege. This is a perfect example of white privilege here, that black women would want to make themselves out to be white and part of white culture. Okay, and yet how is this described? Well, this is described as a perfect example of white privilege, that these white girls feel entitled to appropriate a black woman's culture. Brilliant. I kind of admire that, right? To be that fucking one-sided in the way that these topics are reported. I kind of got to take my hat off to that. Talk about deciding what your conclusion is in advance, then reverse engineering what you're trying to describe to make it fit your narrative. Absolutely brilliant. But that wasn't what I wanted to talk about. What I wanted to talk about was the article which was at the end there, which was from from about a month ago, on cultural appropriation in the fashion industry. And note the headline that the BBC used. The headline the BBC didn't use was "Twitter racists demand fashion apartheid." That was not the headline they used. The headline they used is, "Does fashion have a cultural appropriation problem?" I think the very fact of the headline they used, that was enough in many ways to shock me right from the word go, because that sets the scene. They are taking this shit seriously. They're taking these kinds of demands seriously. Let me read you the first few lines from that article. So it begins, Gigi Hadid in dreads for Marc Jacobs, Gucci models in Sikh-style turbans, Victoria's Secret angels in Native American headdresses. Across the fashion industry, many top designers have faced accusations of cultural appropriation. In 2015, Isabel Marant was accused of plagiarizing the traditional costumes of a Mexican community. A year later, Gucci faced a backlash, and by the way, a backlash means Twitter trolls, which are facing in what, according to the BBC, is the right direction, by the way. Otherwise, it would just call them Twitter trolls, for showing white models in Sikh-style turbans. And in 2017, Vogue was criticised for a shoot in which model Carly Kloss was dressed as a geisha. Only last month, Vogue was again accused of cultural appropriation for a shoot showing Kendall Jenner with an afro. Oh my word, a white woman with an afro. So here we are, folks, in 2018, right? And I just have to say that, right? Because I'm just being a bit flippant, because the current yearism is the way you're supposed to work on these issues. Effectively 63 years after Rosa Parks challenged whites only seats on buses, and we are seriously being expected to consider whether blacks only haircuts is a legitimate stance to take. I mean, how the fuck is this getting a free pass? How the hell are demands for racially segregated clothing and haircuts being reported in a way which is sympathetic to the demands? You know, I can only look at that and sort of wonder. It occurs to me, how will this be viewed in a few decades' time? Will people look back on articles such as this one on the BBC and say, wow, you know, in 2018, look at the historic racism of the BBC, that these people were seriously debating whether precluding certain people from wearing certain clothes or having their hair styled in a certain way based on the colour of their skin was not only a legitimate concern, but was the socially progressive position to hold. Maybe they will seem as outraged then as we would if similar arguments that were actually made back decades ago regarding the racism that existed in those societies at the time, and trying to justify the segregation and the apartheid and the differentiation of people and what they were allowed to do and allowed not to do based upon their race, how those things were viewed. The article goes on. In 2016, designer Marc Jacobs appeared to defend his decision to style white models in dreadlocks. what is there to defend, right? It just really disturbs me that the BBC is writing it in this fashion, unless the writer of this article genuinely believes it is an okay position to say that you can have a haircut that some people are not allowed to have because they've got the wrong fucking skin colour, then what is there to defend? Can you imagine in a million years the BBC writing the line years later, Rosa Parks appeared to defend her position not to give up her seat to a white person? Of course they wouldn't phrase it like that, and they wouldn't phrase it like that because none of us would contend that she had any behaviour to defend. Her behaviour was entirely legitimate. What the hell is poor fucking Mark Jacobs having to defend here, unless what you're saying is that this form of racism is legitimate? We then went on to have a couple of quotes by a guy called Dr. Serkan Delice, who is a lecturer in cultural and historical studies. This was what Serkan Delice had to say. He said, "I have a piece of cake and I intend to entirely eat that piece of cake now, while simultaneously retaining it for future consumption." Okay, so that wasn't what he said, but what he said was more or less the same thing. This was what he actually said. Dr. Delice says, "Cultural appropriation only happens when there are power inequalities between different cultures. We are still living in a world where white people and institutions are much more powerful than black and brown people and their institutions. So it wouldn't be cultural appropriation because cultural appropriation implies that a more powerful culture is using another less powerful culture." How fucking convenient is that? Who would have guessed that would have been the argument that was drummed up? So we're going to keep making these arguments. As soon as somebody makes it in reverse, oh, well, there's always a fucking reason why you can't make it in reverse. It's not just an appeal for racial segregation, but it's also a justification for why what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine as well. You know, don't you dare deny me the chance to express myself however I would like and take and cherry pick whatever of yours that I would like, but don't you dare come and take any of what's mine. That's my culture and you're not entitled to any of it. And to be quite honest with you, this business of power inequality, it doesn't really make any sense to me in this context. It's a bit like saying, well, young people can wear the kind of clothes that old people wear, but old people should never wear the kind of clothes that young people wear because there's a power inequality. Why does it matter? Even if there is a power inequality, how does that make any difference when it comes to how people are styling their hair or what clothes they are wearing, for God's sake? How is it diminishing the lot of those people at the bottom of that power stack, that the way they style themselves, that their culture is getting more representation and is becoming more mainstream? The argument doesn't even make any sense. Okay, the guy then goes on to say something else. What he goes on to say is this: what we need is more cultural diversity, but we need to do whatever we can to marginalise all non-white cultures to make the process almost impossible. Okay, again, he doesn't say that. Let me read you what he does say, and it's practically indistinguishable from what I've just read there. The article states, Dr. Delice believes that designers should make sure people from the culture it originated from should take part in producing the clothes that are inspired by them. That's the only solution. In other words, if you're doing a runway show, then you need to use the original inhabitants of that region or in the production process. Okay, maybe you can see the issue, right? Maybe you would like to see more diversity in these things. I can tell you that I would. And the reason that I would is that I look out around the world and I see such marvellous diversity. Right, the diversity of human experience, of human culture is absolutely fantastic. Whether it's fashion, whether it's food, whether it's music, it is a wonderful, wonderful tribute to the human condition that we have all this amazing diversity, and I would like to see that expressed. And when you get things like food and fashion, you're fusing those things together in a wonderful way that actually ends up sort of organically creating new things which actually didn't even exist there in the first place. Brand new things by fusing these things and mashing these things together. But if you have a situation where effectively what you're saying is, okay, so you want to have a bit of a Japanese theme with kimonos, then you need to make sure that all your models are Japanese. You want to have a bit of an African vibe going on with a sort of tribal approach and all this kind of thing, use those kind of fashions, then you need to use African models. You can't have a white model in there wearing those kinds of clothing. Can you not see what the issue is here? By making these things so restrictive, if you're a designer, you're going to think, well, this is just too much trouble, right? I don't want to have to jump through these hoops to do these things. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll take my work in another direction. Let's keep it simple and safe. There's so much diversity within sort of white fashion culture anyway. There are plenty of things I can explore without treading on people's toes, without being totally restrictive in terms of the models that I use and how I portray the clothes that I want to make. So I'll tell you what I'll do. All these other fashions, all these other cultures, I just won't bother. What you're doing is you're setting the bar so high that what you end up doing is marginalizing these other cultures rather than doing what you could be doing, which is bringing them into the mainstream. And this is what I find so hypocritical about this. You effectively, in some cases, having the same people banging on the table and demanding that we spend more attention and have more respect and have more time for all these different cultures. Let's roll our eyes again because, oh, here we are. Everything's so white. All the culture, it's the same white Western culture. Why aren't we incorporating other cultures and celebrating all this thing? And as soon as somebody tries to, well, hang on, you can't do it like that. They want these other cultures to be part of the mainstream, but they don't want them treated in the way that the mainstream treats things. They feel that they've got to be treated in a very, very special and sacred way. I'm sorry, that isn't how the mainstream works. If you want these cultures to be marginalised and kept as some kind of cultural backwater, pushed out the way, I tell you what you're doing, you're going the right way about doing that. And that is the real hypocrisy of all of this. This is undoing some of the good work that some of the same people who'll be moaning about this will be championing on another occasion. That is how little sense it makes. Okay, so what I maybe ought to do at this point is just to sum up. For me, these arguments are racism. It's pure and simple. If they were framed in any other context or in any other direction, an organisation like the BBC would see it exactly for what it is and it would treat it in a certain way. And it staggers me that it gets the soft treatment, that it gets taken seriously and portrayed in the way that it is. It is effectively using almost identical arguments to the arguments that were used for things for whites only and for treating black people in a different way to white people and precluding them from certain things and just dressing them up and saying, hey, this is actually the progressive thing to do. I find it beyond astonishing, and it feels a really, really regressive step. If what you're interested in is getting past racism, then you have to take a bit of a leap into the dark, right? And you have to surrender some things. And I'm afraid part of that includes surrendering your culture, be it your clothes or your music or your haircuts, so that other people can have a piece of that, right? We all have to do that, I'm afraid. Some of us can't sit on the sides and say, well, I'm going to have yours, obviously because I'm entitled to it, but mine's staying in this little enclave, and it's only people that look like me or people that are from the same ethnic group as me that are allowed to indulge in that. I'm sorry, it just doesn't work. And let me be clear, right, when I talk about this in terms of cultural appropriation, I'm not saying that there are no contexts in which cultural appropriation claims can be appropriate. For example, the situation, I think, with the Washington Redskins, where effectively Europeans went over to the United States, killed these people, took their land off them, and then are putting up mock headdresses and calling their team after them. That's kind of taking the piss a little bit there, right? But situations like that are a million miles away from the types of things we're talking about here on a fashion runway, or we're talking about when we're talking about Halloween costumes or all these other ridiculous contexts where this is brought forward. Now, if you were to say to me, Noel, come on man, are you genuinely so concerned about this that it justifies a video and all this angst? No, because I don't think this is one of like the biggest issues that affect society as it is. In some ways, at least it's my hope, it might be misguided, but this kind of thing is going nowhere. It will always remain a very select few people who are making these kinds of concerns. But what does concern me much more than that, as I say, is the BBC's response to this, is media's response to this, because by taking these concerns seriously and actually in many ways seeming to side with the concerns, they are legitimising racist ways of thinking, legitimising racist arguments and arguments for racial segregation and cultural segregation, that there are another band of racists out there that the BBC aren't quite so keen on, right, who will make the same kind of arguments, who do make the same kind of arguments. And when you legitimise those arguments, and when you legitimise actually a grievance of this band of people, then I'm afraid I have to hold you culpable for the approach that you are taking. Okay, thoughts? Interested to know what you think on this particular issue. Thanks for listening to what I have to say on it. Bye for now.